Got a great program for you today. Sam Haydock from BL Companies is going to be speaking about the current state of flux in the Connecticut environmental regulation world. There's a lot going on, and as I'm sure everyone here knows, Sam really, really knows his stuff and is able to distill it down to a level that even us brokers can understand. So that's going to be a really great presentation. And just to let everybody know, that part of the presentation will be recorded. So if you have any issues with that, now you know. After the educational component, he's going to have a Q&A session. So both during his presentation and afterward, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and I will be able to bring them up to Sam and moderate those. Once the Q&A is done, he'll be leading a team-based game of brain teasers with a prize at the end. I got a bit of a sneak peek at them, and they are a lot of fun and pretty challenging. So we're gonna have a good time with those. And then finally, we're gonna wrap up the evening with a little bit of haves and wants and deal share type conversation. So before we start the program, I want to take a quick moment to thank our annual sponsors. Without you, we really wouldn't be able to do what we do. We wouldn't be able to put on our programming. And just want you to know that we are very grateful for your support. The companies, our annual sponsors, are BL Companies, of course, Chelsea Groton, Community Investment Corporation, Cone Resnick, Dime Bank, Guilford Savings Bank, Ion Bank, JP McGuire, Newtown Savings Bank of Danbury, 10X, the Town of Brantford, and Wells Fargo. Thank you all very much for your support. If you're here, hello, it's great to see you. And we look forward to seeing a lot more of you during the year as it goes on. So now I'd like to introduce Sam. He has been, Sam's for more than 35 years of experience in environmental and land use consulting. He's a principal in the firm, the director of business development and consulting, and client care for the environmental division at BL Companies, and was previously director of Northeast Environmental Operations. He serves as program manager and senior project manager for complex environmental programs and projects. He also has extensive experience with environmental projects and industrial clients, developers, institutions, municipalities, municipal development entities, and state agencies. He's got a lot of experience. His technical background includes designing and managing site characterization studies for containment investigations, design and management of complex site remediation and brownfields, redevelopment projects, environmental permitting, groundwater exploration and development, water resource assessment, and land use impact evaluations. Sam, thank you very much for coming. Really looking forward to the program.
Great. Thank you, Gus. Let me share my screen here and get this going as a slideshow. Yeah, so thank you very much. There is a lot going on in the state of Connecticut with regulations right now, a tremendous amount that's happened since the last time we came and presented to you guys for, I think at that time you might have been getting some credit for continuing education. So what I want to try to do is walk through some of what's going on at a fairly high level. Try not to get too down into the weeds. Would encourage you to ask questions at any point along the way. Gus commented that I know a lot about this stuff, but I'd like to point out that Jeff Ryer, I think he wins the award as the commercial broker who's been to more environmental update webinars and programs than anybody else that I see on the screen here anyway. And so if I stumble on something, Jeff probably knows the answer.
I will defer.
The only other thing I would add to what Gus said about my background is a big part of what I do is to try to keep deals happening, try to make deals go forward, resolve environmental issues for buyers, for sellers, identify them early on so they don't come up at the 11th hour and hopefully keep properties moving, keep properties being bought and sold, keep properties being redeveloped. That's what we really try to do here. If you don't know BL, we are based in Connecticut. We have Hartford and Meriden. We have about 230 people in Connecticut. We also have now, I think, 17 offices around the country. And interestingly enough, and I guess we're blessed, we hired over 80 people last year in the middle of COVID. So industrial and e-commerce has been good to BL. We are environmental consultants, architects, engineers, and land surveyors, provide many different services under one roof. Environmental is a big part of that. But we also have transportation and infrastructure engineering, structural engineering, MEP engineering, survey, as I said, civil, as I said. So all told, we're about 380 people right now, which is, I've been with BL for 21, 22 years, and we struggled around for the first, I'd say 20 years. We stayed right around the 250 mark, maybe dropped down to 150 during the 2008, 2009 recession. But the last couple of years, we've really seen some great growth. So again, we're blessed to be experiencing that. With regard to the regulations, like I said, there's a lot going on. And we have, so there's 5 different areas that I'll talk about. One is called Wave 2, recent revisions to our remediation standard regulations, also known as the RSRs. That's sort of the cookbook for what I do, what the cookbook that I follow to take sites through the investigation and remediation process. We have environmental use restrictions, formerly known as environmental land use restrictions. Now they've broken those into 2 different categories, and at the high level, they're just called EURs, or environmental use restrictions. Those changes are also effective as of February 16th. We have spill reporting regulations in progress. The big news, which has gotten you folks most excited, has been the move towards sunsetting the Transfer Act, and that is in progress, sort of. And we have the development of what will replace the Transfer Act, the release-based, and I wrote reporting there, but it's actually the release-based remediation regulations, and those are also in progress. So with respect to the RSRs and what is called the Wave 2 revisions, this has been a long time coming. The RSRs go back to 1997, which is when the state put in place the Licensed Environmental Professional Program. We didn't really have any revisions at all until 2013. Those were known as the Wave 1 revisions, and those were helpful. There was a lot of things in Wave 1 that have made it easier for us to close sites. So that they were welcome. So it's been 7, 8 years since Wave 1, and that DEEP has been working on Wave 2. There are admit somebody, and in doing that, I moved the screen. But from a broad standpoint, the revisions have increased the available options to bring impacted properties into compliance. So that's helpful. It's given LEPs more options without having to get DEEP approval. At the same time, they have increased the level of protection to human health and the environment where warranted, and that is primarily related to volatile organic compounds in the environment, and the potential for vapors to get into buildings, and for occupants of buildings to be exposed to volatile vapors. There have been some significant changes for some of those compounds. Overall, there's a lot of positive revisions. We do have some concerns, and I will touch on both of those. Let me see, admitting somebody else. So some examples of some of the positive changes. They've given us the option to develop alternative groundwater protection criteria in certain portions of the state. So the shoreline and the Central Valley primarily, we now have the ability to propose an alternative groundwater protection criteria where the groundwater protection criteria still applies because it's a GA groundwater classification area, but where municipal water is available and people aren't actually drinking it. The state has been divided into areas known as GA groundwater quality, which is designed to be used for drinking water, or GB, which is not used for drinking water and understood to potentially be impacted. But we have a lot of areas of the state that are highly developed but still regulated as GA. That drives the cost of remediation. So this gives us an option to develop a site-specific criteria in those areas. Haven't tried it yet. Again, these are all very new. They just went into effect February 16th. I don't know, how hard or easy this will be, but the option is now there. Similarly, we now have more options to develop alternative pollutant mobility criteria. Those are the levels of compounds that are allowed in soil that are going to have an impact on groundwater quality. We have introduced the concept of immobilization as a method for dealing with NAPL. NAPL refers to non-aqueous phase liquids, petroleum, number 6 heating oil, things that have been released into the ground that are present at high concentrations. You now have the ability to potentially immobilize them in place as opposed to having to completely remove them. That's a big deal because removing NAPL can be very expensive. We have the ability for some self-implementing engineering controls, so we don't need DEEP approval for every type of engineered control. We have similar self-implementing approval for designating sites impacted by widespread polluted fill. Do not need to get DEEP approval. That's a big deal. There's modifications to what is considered fill material that is exempt from the pollutant mobility criteria. It includes more things. We think that's good. There's also now pesticide exemptions. If pesticides are present in soil as a result of their routine use under the manufacturer's specifications, you don't necessarily have to clean it up. You do have to put in place some protective measures such as a land use restriction or a soil management plan, depending on the type of property. You still, if you had pesticide storage areas or spills, those would still need to be treated as a release and cleaned up. But again, these are all helpful changes. There's alternative surface water protection criteria, and now there's a formula to develop an alternative surface water protection criteria in tidal waters. This will be very helpful. And then there are also modifications to the polluted fill exception. So these are all things that, from my standpoint, they increase the number of tools I have in my toolbox to take a site through closure and hopefully achieve compliance as cost effectively and quickly as possible. We do have some concerns, though. And there's potential for the number of concerns to grow because these have only been out for about 6 weeks, and we're starting to see some things that are going to likely be unintended consequences. But we have one that was identified early on and continues to be, in my opinion, a huge deal, and that is the applicability of the RSRs. When this program was put into being, the RSRs were put in place under some of Connecticut's broad environmental compliance statutes, 22A 54, 54 is one of them. There's a couple others. These are very broad statutes that require protecting the environment. But for the last 20 years, DEEP has implemented the program such that we all were under the impression that full compliance with the RSRs are only required if you are in a program. The Transfer Act is a program. RCRA Corrective Action is a program. Underground Storage Tank program, or one of the voluntary cleanup programs, or if you were under order by the commissioner, by the department to do a cleanup. But there were many, many instances where it was our impression and the program was implemented in a way such that we could identify contamination at a property, but not necessarily have it be subject to full compliance. Well, during the public comment period for these revisions back in the summer of 2019, at the end of that period, the hearing officer, the DEEP hearing officer, looked at all the comments that were received and issued a report called their Statement of Reasons. And in that Statement of Reasons, DEEP took the position that the RSRs legally apply to every release at every property. And this is a big deal. I'll give you an example of leaking heating oil tank at a residence. You might pull that tank, you might identify the release, you might dig out impacted soil, and you might leave a little bit of soil under the foundation and say, okay, it's there. We're not going to disturb the foundation. We're not going to, potentially disrupt the structural stability of the building. It doesn't represent a huge risk to the occupants, and we're good. We're going to close out this cleanup. Well, today, under this current thinking, that would be subject to full compliance with the RSRs. So you would need to provide public notice to your neighbors. You would need to publish an ad in the newspaper saying that you're going to be doing remediation for that soil, for that heating oil release. You would need a land use restriction or a deed or one of the other EUR options for the stuff you left under the foundation. All of that is significantly more, and you would need a final verification report by an LEP in order to fully comply. That has never happened in the last 20 years. The other example would be the typical phase 2 that we do. Stan brings a buyer to a property and they want to do a phase 2, and we do the phase 2 and we find some contamination, nothing major, but maybe some hydrocarbons or maybe some metals in soil because there's some fill material. We would write a phase 2 report that says that these compounds are present, and we would compare them to the standards in the RSRs, but we would usually conclude that there's no legal obligation to comply with the RSRs because the site is not in a program. I did that for hundreds, if not thousands, of phase 2 reports, and I know my competitors were doing the same thing. Now we can't say that. Now I have to write a report that says, based on recent revisions to the RSRs and DEP's written opinion of the applicability of the RSRs, it appears that there is now a legal obligation to fully comply with the remediation standards for this property. And does that mean you have to enter into the voluntary cleanup program to do that? It's unknown. I'm also vice president of the Environmental Professionals Organization of Connecticut, and we've been very involved in reviewing these regulations. We have raised this issue with DEEP. We have met with Graham Stevens on numerous occasions, and we've actually put forth a 4-page white paper that we submitted to Graham to explain why this is a problem. And Graham initially agreed that this had to be addressed and that there needed to be clarification. It doesn't appear now that we're going to get that. Graham presented at a webinar for the Environmental Business Council last week, and I wasn't there, but I heard he said that the RSRs legally apply to every release at every property. And so, this is a concern for us. It's a departure from 20 years of precedent. I think it has the potential to cause a lot of additional costs where that might not have been the case in the past. There are some other concerns with the with the Wave 2 revisions. It appears that the reuse of polluted soil below RSR criteria may be a little bit more restrictive, potentially, especially on construction sites where you're digging a foundation or you're doing grading and you run across material. It appears that there may be notification and approval requirements that has the potential to increase cost and, more importantly, cause delays in the process. We're still seeking some clarification on that. There's also some lack of transition language between sites that are currently in the system and have gone, maybe they're at the 90-yard line or the 80-yard line in terms of achieving compliance. Do they now all of a sudden have to go back and potentially address things that were allowed under the old version, but not under the new version? There is some transition language in there, but there's lots of examples where it's not addressed. So we're still trying to figure out what that means. I mentioned the increased desire by DEEP to protect human health and the environment. So there are more stringent volatilization criteria. The volatilization criteria now apply to groundwater 30 feet below the surface. It used to be 15 feet. And in some cases, the numbers are significantly lower. That's particularly true for some of the degreasing solvents like trichloroethylene. But there are other chlorinated solvents where the numbers have actually gone up. You are allowed to continue to use the old criteria for a couple more years, depending on where you are in the process. So that may or may not be helpful, depending on where you are in the process. And then for surface water, they have what they call low dilution surface water scenarios, where you have groundwater discharging into a swamp or a wetland or an intermittent stream where there's not a lot of dilution available to dilute the pollutants. In that scenario, you have to meet instead of the surface water protection criteria, you have to meet the aquatic toxicity criteria that's published in the state's water quality standards. And now, in addition to that, you have to meet the lower of either the human health criteria or the aquatic tox criteria. And for some compounds like arsenic or trichloroethylene, the human health criteria is several orders of magnitude lower. So again, that's going to make cleanups harder and more costly. We think that DEEP could have done this whole thing a little bit better. There were a lot of comments issued by LEPs in the regulated community that were ignored. And there are clarifications that could have been made that were not made. As a practitioner that has to, I'm licensed as an LEP, I'm a deputy of the state. I'm licensed to manage and investigation and remediation, and I have an obligation to protect human health and the environment. And to have regulations
you called a little while ago. I'm sort of on a Zoom meeting now. But
someone needs to mute.
From this guy, you probably.
I'm licensed. I have an obligation to protect human health and the environment, and to have regulations that aren't clear, or to ask me to ignore what the written position is that the state has taken with respect to how the regulations are meant to be implemented is not right. Graham Stevens has said, well, especially with the applicability issue, he said, that's what it says, but we're not necessarily going to make you put every site into a program. But if you read what the RSRs now say, that's what's required. And so, again, asking us to do things that conflict with what the regulations say creates a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of LEPs out there who feel they might be putting their license at risk unless they do strict compliance with the RSRs for every release on every property. So, Time will tell. Hopefully, again, the positive changes will outweigh the negatives. That's what we're hoping. I've got 4 other LEPs in my shop, and we're meeting weekly to go through these changes so we can understand exactly what they mean, both to our existing sites and to future sites. There's a lot in there to absorb and digest. Any questions on anything so far that I've covered?
Yeah.
So far, nothing in the chat, but please do, if you have a question, now's a good time to break in.
I have one. Hi, Tom Hill.
Hey, Tom.
Thank you as always for training us. What about another public hearing that Joan Hartley and Senator Simons came together, or would that have to be on Zoom for the community to come out and express their questions?
So there's a couple different things going on with respect to that. EPOC has currently set up a process and produced a form for the LEPs to put their questions in writing, submit them to EPOC. We will act as a clearinghouse and get all those questions to DEEP. We're hoping that we'll get some clarifications, maybe some minor revisions that come out of that. If that process doesn't work, then some of these issues may have to get elevated. I think it's a little too early to tell how necessary that is at this point. And in light of all the other things that are going on, we do need to pick our battles carefully. You only get so much time and so much attention span with our legislators. They're very busy. If you've ever spent any time around them, you know that they are dealing with 1,000 issues at a time, and they all have to be, from their standpoint, they're looking at them at a high level. So it's an option. I think you'll see as I go on and talk about some of the other changes and things that are happening that there are going to be opportunities, but whether it's looking forward to the changes that they're trying to make or whether it's looking backwards to changes that have already been made, time will tell.
All right, may I also follow up that your red hair looks blazingly beautiful today?
Where's that mute button? Yeah.
Sam, with this new law, how do you see it impacting the cost of doing the analysis and the remediation and the time? I see with the indecisive and the vague way the regulations are written, that it's going to add more time to the project. Would I be correct?
Yeah, I'm going to hold my answer on that till we get through some of the other things, and then maybe the picture becomes more clear about some of the concerns that I'm having. I guess the answer is really the jury's out. If you listen to DEEP and you read their press releases, all of these changes that are being made are going, according to Katie and Commissioner Lehman, all of these changes are going to make cleanups happen faster, be more cost effective, and are going to bring developers flocking in from out of state to buy properties in Connecticut now. I'm not quite that optimistic.
Is that because they passed the marijuana?
Yeah, maybe. So moving on, environmental land use restrictions. We previously had just the environmental land use restriction, all of which required DEEP signatures and approval, a very lengthy process, and in some cases could take years to get in place, depending on how many parties had interest in your property. Under the revisions, we have 2 categories now. We have the ELUR, which will remain pretty much as it was in terms of requiring DEEP sign off. And now we have a notice of activity and use limitation, which is for certain situations where you can have either DEEP or LEP sign off. And there's a number of situations where you can use the notice of activity and use limitation. If if you're going to restrict residential use and the property is zoned industrial commercial, if your inaccessible soil is less than 10 times the standards, if your environmentally isolated soil is going to be less than 10 times the standards, certain pesticide scenarios, widespread polluted fill, and certain engineered controls are examples of where you can use the notice of activity and use limitation. One of the benefits is that the notice of activity and use limitation is a notice on the deed. It is not an interest in the land, so it does not require subordination agreements. And subordination agreements have been one of the biggest sticking points for ELURs in the past. So that I think is going to be helpful, but there are going to be fees associated with either one of the EURs. I don't think the actual fee schedule has been published yet, but eventually it's going to be $5,000 for an environmental land use restriction and $2,250 or $2,500. I'm not sure, one of those two for a null or a notice of activity and use limitation. There are also going to be hard deadlines. If you start the process and you can't get it completed within 120 days or 180 days, you actually have to start all over again and go to the back of the line, and you may, in fact, have to pay the fees again. So if you have the need for subordination agreements, you better get them before you even start the application process. I've had a couple of sites where the subordination agreements have dragged things out for unacceptable periods of time. The new regulations require fact sheet and notice requirements on the property where the ELUR or the null is in effect. There is no requirement for that today. There's going to be a requirement to post in visible areas of the property a fact sheet that describes the restriction and what can and can't be done as a result of the restriction. Don't know exactly what this is going to look like yet. The fact sheet is not out yet. And so, but that's new. I also, going back to the wave too, I started to say that there were all these forms related to compliance with the RSRs that now all have to be changed because of the revisions, and they don't have any of them done yet. There's something on the order of 31 or 32 forms that have to be revised. And they should have, when I talked about opportunities missed, that was an opportunity missed. These forms should have been all revised and gone out for they should have been part of the public comment process, because, for instance, right now, if you wanted to apply for an environmental land use restriction, you can't, because you can't use the old form, and you can't use, and they don't have the new one yet. That is, that's something we're going to have to wait for. And we don't know what this fact sheet looks like yet. That is also something we're going to have to wait for. Lastly.
Oh, sorry, Say, we've got a question from the audience real quick.
Yeah.
So it seems these measures reduce Connecticut's competitiveness. How do these regulations compare to the surrounding states?
Right now, Connecticut is still, the goal of the proposed remediation-based regulations is to sunset the Transfer Act and try to bring us more in line what surrounding states have to offer, or what surrounding states require for environmental compliance. But right now, we're still operating under the Transfer Act. We're still operating under the RSRs. And, one of the things that is the biggest problem with our program is that they require you to prove the negative. You have to prove that your site is not contaminated. And that is, when we talk about the Transfer Act being broken, one of the biggest problems with the Transfer Act is the amount of investigation that is required to prove that your property is not contaminated. That still exists right now. That has not gone away, and it won't go away until the new regulations come into play. So I think right now we're still subject to environmental regulations that deter investment from out-of-state parties. The last thing I'll say on the EURs is that DEEP they started just prior to COVID enforcing the restrictions that are imposed by the ELUR. They started doing inspections. They found in almost every property they looked at, they found that in some form or another, the ELUR requirements were not being complied with. Many of them were very minor, where someone had put in a fence post or a sign post or done something minor that disturbed soil that was not meant to be disturbed. But they also found many what they considered to be severe or significant violations of the ELUR, and so it is going to be one of their hot button items to enforce EURs and nulls going forward. And this fact sheet and notice requirements is part of that. But once we get out of this COVID environment, I think we'll see a lot of properties being inspected. The third item are the proposed spill regulations. One of the 20 by 20 goals that Katie Dykes put forth at the beginning of 2020 to finally get these passed. These regulations have been in the works for years, and they've just never been passed. Right now, we have regulations or requirements in place where any amount of any quantity of a regulated substance is considered a spill. You could spill a thimble full of gasoline, and technically it's a spill that requires reporting to DEEP. So the goal is to develop some categories and develop some additional criteria to try to control the number of spills that get reported to DEEP, but still be protective of human health and the environment, and certainly capture the worst spills and maybe let some of the ones that don't really have any impact to the environment go. So there will be different categories. Category 1 is any quantity of specific types of releases to a waterway, from an underground storage tank, PCBs, solvents, pesticides, things like that. Category 2, spills of 5 gallons or less, if cleaned within 1 hour, they don't have to be reported. And then category 3, 1.5 gallons of liquid or 10 pounds of solid, if not oil or petroleum, if cleaned within 1 hour, may be exempt from reporting. There's a bunch of other exemptions, permitted releases, agricultural activity, parking lot runoff. There will be a 2-phase reporting process with an initial report to the response, and then subsequent action that may be required to mitigate the release. These are pretty different than what was proposed in 2009, but here we are 11 years later. We still don't have updated modern spill reporting regulations. If you want to know about it in more detail, DEEP has this flow chart, which you can only see part of, that create exemptions. This puts all the exemptions into a flow chart and sort of creates a pathway for whether you have to report or whether you can avoid reporting. So those are now available for public comment. Like Wave 2 and like the EUR revisions, they have to go through a required statutory public comment period. You can go to the DEEP website. You can find a link to the proposed regulations, and you can find information on how you report or how you submit public comments. And there will be a public hearing which I want to believe is sometime in May. I can track that down if anyone's interested and get that information out to you folks.
That would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Sam, just to piggyback off the question from before, the questioner wasn't talking so much about the Transfer Act, but just the clearing of environmental contamination in Connecticut versus other states around us. Are the levels we have to clean up to significantly higher, more stringent? What are your thoughts?
It varies. We have, under the existing regulations, the RSRs do create different options for different scenarios. If it's property is residential use versus industrial commercial, there's different criteria, with the industrial commercial being higher. If a property is in a GA groundwater class, it's more stringent. If you're in a GB groundwater class, some of the standards don't apply at all. Connecticut the DEP will tell you that those options are what is considered to be a risk-based, is risk-based. But what is, it really isn't. And what is lacking in Connecticut is the ability to do a true risk assessment by a qualified professional to determine whether the presence of contamination has a complete exposure pathway or not. And if there's no complete exposure pathway whereby people could become in contact with the contaminants, then you can leave it in place. We have been asking for a risk-based cleanup program for 20 plus years. Massachusetts, the Massachusetts contingency plan has specific criteria that you have to clean up to, and some of the numbers are pretty similar to ours. But they also have the ability to do a full-blown risk assessment and leave contamination in place if the licensed site professional determines that there is no risk. That's a big difference. The other thing that's a big difference between Connecticut and Massachusetts are background concentrations for anthropogenic or man-made activities. You know, we have this issue of naturally occurring substances such as metals. Arsenic is an example. You have to prove, if you have a site and you have arsenic impacts over the standards, you have to prove that it's naturally occurring if it didn't result from a release. That can cost a lot of money. The other thing is we're an industrial state. We created land for hundreds of years using ash, wood ash, coal ash, other types of fill material. And Massachusetts recognizes that you can have anthropogenic background, and that is important for metals and what a group of compounds called PAHs, which are very common in the ash materials. So Massachusetts has much higher numbers for background for the PAHs that allows them to stay in place, whereas in Connecticut, we have extremely low numbers. Benzoate pyrene is one of the PAHs, and it is a carcinogen, but we regulate it to an extremely low level at any type of site. And in many cases, it's been there for 100 years, had nothing to do with the activity on the property. It's there because somebody created the land. And if somebody takes that property through the Transfer Act, they have to deal with that. So that's a problem. So the last thing I want to talk about is this attempt to transition or sunset the Transfer Act. And that's by creating this release-based remediation program. So we have a new Public Act 20-09 that went into effect October 2nd of last year. It has two components to it. Sections 1 through 14 deal with some modifications to the Transfer Act. They modify the definition of a transfer, definition of an establishment, and then sections 15 through 23 are put in place the framework, the statutory authority to develop a new set of regulations, which will be known as the release-based remediation program. So this has been in the works for quite some time. It's failed on more than one occasion to sunset the Transfer Act, 2008, 2011. In 2019, Public Act 1975 was passed, and it had a couple of revisions to the Transfer Act, exempting hazardous building materials and certain types of cleanout or shutdown activities from triggering the Transfer Act, which those are good revisions. Those help. You know, if you shut down a facility and you cleaned it out, you had a one-time generation of hazardous waste, and that's the only time you ever generated hazardous waste, you don't belong in the Transfer Act. So that's helpful. It also created a work group to continue to to make other revisions to the Transfer Act. There were a lot of revisions that people wanted under Public Act 1975 that didn't happen, but they put the line item in there to create work groups to continue that process. So that work group started meeting in 2020 and made additional revisions to the Transfer Act. Again, most of which are helpful. The industrial condominium issue, I think, has been resolved. So if you have a industrial commercial property with 10 condominium units on it, and one of those units is an establishment, any transfer of that business only has to focus on the activities of that business that met the definition of an establishment, not the entire property. Multi-tenant properties, the shopping center with the dry cleaner, same concept. If you sell the dry cleaner, you have to investigate the dry cleaner and any portions of the property used by the dry cleaner, but not the entire property. These are helpful revisions. There were some other changes in wording and definition and things like that. It excludes transfer of stock or ownership less than 50%. Former cutoff was 40%. Removed where the universal waste exception is written into the regulations. Excludes the change in name of an LLC. Again, things that used to draw sites into the Transfer Act for no good reason. It also consolidates exemptions regarding sites that are in the brownfield cleanup programs, the ABC, the BRRP, or the Connecticut Land Bank program. So again, all good things. And then the remaining sections set up this statutory framework to create this new set of regulations. Upon the passage of these new regulations, the Transfer Act will go away. So we finally have a regulatory process in place, or a statutory process in place to make this happen. So this sections 15 through 23 create the framework for this new program and require that they develop regulations to implement the program. If you understand how Connecticut's government works, you have statutes and you have regulations. You need statutes in order to create regulations. So we now have the statute. Now we need to build the regulation. Section 15 covers definitions. Of note, person now includes corporate officers. It did not in many of our other environmental programs. So that's somewhat significant. It specifically distinguishes between new and historical releases. And it redefines remediation to now include investigation and cleanup. Section 16 is the heart of the statute. It prohibits creating or maintaining a release. And thereby, in Section 17, requires reporting and cleanup if you have created or are maintaining a release. It requires the development of a uniform standard for cleanup. We may end up with standards that don't look anything like what we have today. The RSRs could go away through this process. We just don't know yet. And it also requires sites in existing programs to complete those obligations. That's important. We have 4,000 sites subject to the Transfer Act program right now that have entered into the program and have not yet had a final verification. Those Transfer Act sites need to complete those obligations This new program won't allow that to go away. Section 18, enforcement and penalties. Of course, they have to have that teeth. They have to have teeth in the statute. Section 19 is the requirement to establish the regulations that include reporting requirements, remediation standards, standards for verifications and audits, hopefully tiering of different classifications and categories of releases based on their severity. Hopefully it will allow for risk assessment, like I talked about in Massachusetts. Fees for going through the program, of course, they got to collect money. And the process, working group and stakeholder outreach, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Section 20 is audits. Section 21 is liability relief. I'm not sure what's in 22, and 23 is just other authority. Those really don't impact the things that I'm concerned about. So, this is a huge shift. When this program is in place, it will apply to all properties, not to properties that meet the definition of an establishment or properties that trigger an obligation because they were bought or sold. One of the biggest complaints about the Transfer Act is that it doesn't apply to all properties. You can have the contaminated disaster down the street that's never been bought or sold, and it's sitting there contaminating the well field or the neighbor's property. Whereas, the other properties, because of, some past generation or some minor activity, get drawn into the program when they shouldn't really be. So this will apply to all properties. It's going to be looking forward. So if you have a report in the file cabinet that shows you did investigation years ago and there's contamination on your property, they're not going to go hunting for those. You're not going to have an obligation to pull that report out and say, oh, I've got a report now. The regs won't apply to the entire site. They are release based. So if you find a release, if you detect a release, then you have an obligation to move forward, find it, report it, investigate it, remediate it as needed under the new program. There will be tiers for minor versus severe. And what the different tiers are going to look like and what the activities are in each tier that are required is still an unknown. Areas of concern are going to go away. I talked about before this process of having to prove the negative. In Connecticut, when you do a phase 1, the ASTM standard requires that you identify recognized environmental conditions as defined by ASTM. Well, Connecticut always went one step further, and they defined through their site characterization guidance document areas of concern. And people from out of state were always amazed that you have your traditional recs, but then you have these areas of concern, which you have to investigate as part of the process, which in other states no one would even look at. So AOCs will go away. We'll have recognized environmental concerns or conditions, and we're going to have release areas. Hopefully, the site characterization guidance document will become irrelevant, and we will no longer be required to prove the negative. And I think that's where the biggest potential change lies. But we still don't know what the new regulations are going to look like. There's a lot of heavy lifting to be done to define all of these different things: reportable concentrations, reportable quantities, tiers and timeframes, self-implementing risk-based alternatives, overlap with other programs and statutes. This is going to take some time, at least 2 years, maybe longer. The statute required, as I noted, that there be put forth work groups to form the regulations. Those are in process. We have one work group established by DEP that has about 70 active participants in it. LEPs, environmental attorneys, real estate professionals, environmental protection and advocacy groups. Out of that work group, we've now got 5 subcommittees that are currently meeting to determine the definition of a historical release, reporting of a historical release, characterization of historical release, immediate response actions and tiers. Those 5 subcommittees are tasked with producing white papers by June 11th. DEEP will then take that information and they will sort through it. And more than likely, the outcome of that effort will result in another group of 3 or 4 subcommittees to take things to the next level. But a lot of work still has to be done. As I said before, the Transfer Act still applies to deals and sites until it doesn't. Until these new regulations pass, the Transfer Act applies. If you sell an establishment today, tomorrow, next month, next year, you're likely still going to have to go through the Act. If you have a site that's already in the Act, it's got to complete its obligations. As I noted before, the RSR and EUR revisions are final. The spill reporting regs are pending. We have this applicability issue with the RSRs that they now apply to every release at every property. That's likely not going to go away until this new set of regulations is final. I just don't think DEEP is going to issue a clarification. I think they're just going to leave it murky, unfortunately. So what does all this mean for the impact on deal flow and the impact on due diligence over the next couple of years? I'm already getting calls from out-of-state folks saying, hey, I hear the Transfer Act's gone away. Tell me what that means. Unfortunately, it hasn't. And how all of this stuff is going to play out, how these new revisions are going to play out, what the spill reporting regs are going to look like, and what it's going to mean to cleaning up and investigating properties over the next year and a half. It's going to be confusing. There's lack of clarity. My job as a consultant should be able to tell you what our regulations mean, what you have to do and when. Right now, there's a lot of confusion out there as to whether we can really definitively state that. And I think as we move closer to the transition to the new regs, there's potential that deal flow will stop. If you own an establishment and you've heard that the new regs are 6 months away, you're not going to put it on the market. You're going to wait. And hopefully that 6 months doesn't become a year and then a year and a half and then 2 years. So I'm concerned about that. I think that happened back in the 90s when they came out with the RSRs. People stopped putting properties on the market. They were waiting to see what the new regulations were going to look like. The other thing that's, really going to be intriguing to see what happens is with the new regulations, what happens in the marketplace versus what the regulations mean. The regulations, the release-based regulations, as I said, will only apply to a release, not necessarily the whole site. But if you're a buyer, don't you still want to have the whole property investigated? So from that standpoint, the marketplace is still going to dictate how a lot of this stuff plays out. So I think that's what I had. It's a lot of material. Hopefully I didn't put you all to sleep. The goal of DEEP, as they say, is to make cleanups quicker, more cost effective, and attract buyers into the state, make the state more competitive for economic development. I have a lot of concerns. While there's a lot of things that may be helpful here, I have a lot of concerns that we're going to have a lot of unintended consequences over the next couple of years. And if these new regs get rushed through without thinking through all this stuff, that list of unintended consequences could grow even greater. So with that, it's just I've gone past my time limit. I told Gus I wasn't going to talk for more than 30 minutes, but that rarely happens. I will open it up for a couple more questions.
Yeah, that's great, Sam. To start it off, we do have a question from the audience. Just to clarify, do you anticipate that we won't have any new regulations for between 1 and 2 years at least?
I think it's going to be. So I think when we were in the work groups last year, Katie had a goal of the new regulations being in place by July 1, 2022. What's the significance of that date? Well, for one, they're anticipating a huge wave of retirements at DEP by July 1st, 2022. I'm not sure whether there's a contract that comes up or whether they just know from
It
the
has to do with
demographics.
benefits. It's their benefits, Stan. That's
Yeah.
them. If they don't do it, then they lose in the increases in their retirements.
Yeah. And so I think she was hoping to have them in place before that. I think Graham Stevens had been sort of saying 1 to 2 years all along. I heard him say recently that we're not going to pass them until we get them right, whatever that means. So, this effort has failed twice in the past. There's a lot of things to work through. Our work groups, we've been meeting now, I think we're on the 7th or 8th week of these subcommittees meeting to try on those 5 categories, and we spin our wheels. There's, and partly because we're working in silos, there's all these issues that are left to the other groups, but we need to know what they're doing in order to know how it affects what we want the regulations to look like. So, it's going to be a while, I think.
So I've got 3 questions or so in the box, and I think we probably won't have time for more than maybe one past that. But I'll go. I'll read some out. If you have a property with a spill that is not an establishment, what law governs now before the release-based regulations are promulgated? Do you have to comply with the RSRs or enter a program with DEEP?
We do have spill regulations, but they are very outdated. A spill is a release is defined, or a spill is defined as spilling, emptying, pouring, filling, discharging. It goes on and on, all in the present tense as an active event of a regulated compound or substance in any amount. And so there are spill regulations that require you to report. The spill division at DEEP usually cares about making sure the release has stopped. So you'll see thousands of spill reports every year in Connecticut, and usually it indicates that the spill report is closed. All that means is that the spill division has determined that the release has been terminated and there's no threat to waterways or no ongoing discharge. Does not mean that there isn't a impact to soil or groundwater or land and waters of the state that has to be further investigated and remediated. And if you are not subject to the Transfer Act or any of the other existing programs, I do believe you're captured under 22A 454 or 22A 455, maybe. There's 2 broad environmental protection statutes in the state of Connecticut that prohibit the presence of contamination. The difference is that for the last 20 years, DEEP has implemented the RSRs with the understanding that you only have to legally achieve compliance with all aspects of the RSRs if you're in a program. And now they're saying from February 16th, 2021 going forward, they're saying that's not the case.
Gotcha. So if you don't mind, we're running up against the clock, but real quick, have the new rules created a new affirmative disclosure requirements for sellers on commercial or residential?
I'm not an attorney, but I don't think so. I don't think there's any change on disclosure requirements.
Okay. And then finally, do you anticipate any change to the Transfer Act where a property is deemed a Transfer Act property despite having clean soil?
Well, the definition of properties are designated as an establishment under the Transfer Act based on either being dry cleaner, furniture stripper, or auto body at any time after May 1st, 1967, or any property that generates more than 100 kilograms a month at any time after November 1980. So you become an establishment based on one of those activities. And then if you are an establishment and you have a trigger, i.e. a transfer, then you have an obligation to evaluate whether you have contamination or not. I don't see any change to that between now and the sunset.